The sound was small. That was the thing nobody who heard it would ever be able to explain properly, not even years later when the story had grown large enough to fill a room. It was not a slam. It was not a crash or a bang or any of the violent sounds that accompany the great ruptures of a life. It was just a small, quiet click. The sound of a door settling into its frame. The sound of a latch falling home. Marin Ashby stood on the other side of it and did not move. The September air pressed against her like cold water, thin and sharp at that altitude, carrying with it the dry smell of juniper and the faint mineral bite of dust that had not seen rain in 6 weeks. The porch boards beneath her worn boots were familiar boards. She had walked across them 10,000 times. She knew the exact placement of the nail that caught on the left heel, if you weren't careful, knew the way the third plank from the door gave a low groan in the mornings when the temperature dropped. She knew this porch the way she knew her own breathing. She did not turn around. In her left hand, she held a small leather pouch. Inside it, $17. The sum total of what Gideon Ashby had determined his eldest child was worth as a departing figure, a subtraction from a household that could no longer absorb the arithmetic of another winter. $17. She had counted it twice in the early morning dark before anyone else was awake, sitting on the edge of her cot with the pouch in her lap, listening to the sound of her father's breathing from the next room. Slow and heavy and untroubled, the breathing of a man who had already made his peace with the decision. In her right hand, she held something else. A document folded 3 times the paper, brittle along the creases from years spent in the bottom of her grandmother's cedar chest. A deed of property. The land and all improvements thereupon, if any, exist located in the territory designated Hollow Rock, in the high frontier country east of the ridge, containing approximately 40 acres of stone and scrub. Issued in the name of Ida Ashby, deceased these past 4 months. The only thing Gideon had given her from his mother's sparse effects. He had set it on the table beside the leather pouch without ceremony, without meeting her eyes, and said the things she had been hearing in various forms for 18 years of her life. A woman grown makes her own way. His voice had been flat the way it always got when he had already thought something through completely, and arrived at the end of it, and there was nothing left to discuss. She had not argued. She had not cried. She had folded the deed carefully along its existing creases, placed it in the interior pocket of her coat, where it pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, and gone to bed. And now she was standing on the porch in the cold September morning with $17 in one hand and 40 acres of possibility in the other, and the door was latched behind her, and the only direction available was forward. She almost looked back. That was the truth of it, the part she would never say aloud to anyone. For one suspended moment, with the cold settling into the back of her neck, and the vastness of the open country stretching out before her like a problem she had not studied for, she almost turned around, almost pressed her hand flat against the door and pushed. What stopped her was not courage. It was the image that would have been waiting for her if she had turned. The pale face of Clem Ashby, 11 years old, watching from behind the rippled glass of the front window. She had seen his reflection there in the corner of her eye just before the latch fell. He had not waved. He had not mouthed any words. He had simply stood there with his small hands at his sides and his eyes carrying something that 11-year-old eyes should not have to carry. She could not give him the sight of her turning back. She would not teach him that lesson. Some doors once closed must be walked away from, or they will swallow you whole. Marin Ashby picked up her bundle from the porch boards, adjusted it across her shoulders, and walked down the lane without looking back once. The walk to Silver Creek was 4 miles along a wagon-rutted road that wound through country she had known her entire life. She walked it now with the attention of someone cataloging things they might not see again. The way the light came through the cottonwood trees in long, slanted columns in the early morning. The particular gray-brown color of the hills to the east, like old pewter, like the color of something useful that had been used for a long time. The sound of a meadowlark somewhere off to the left, a sound so familiar it had become invisible, and now this morning she could hear every note of it. She arrived at Silver Creek before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. The town was not much. It had never been much. A mercantile, a livery, a boarding house of uncertain reputation, a small church that had been trying to complete its steeple for 3 years and had run out of money twice. The kind of town that existed because the land required it, not because anyone had particularly wanted to build one there. A collection of buildings that served the function of keeping people alive long enough to keep trying. The bell above the door of Finn's Mercantile made its small announcement as Marin pushed inside. The smell of the place wrapped around her immediately a thick and comforting inventory of human need. Cured meats dry goods. The sharp, clean smell of fresh-cut pine boards stacked in the corner. The oily sweetness of leather and iron tools. Sacks of flour stood against the far wall in a row like patient soldiers. Tins of coffee and salt and preserved goods lined the shelves behind the long counter with their handwritten labels. Everything had a price. Everything was available if you had the means to acquire it. Aldous Fenn was behind the counter, his spectacles pushed up on his forehead, working a pencil across a column of figures in his ledger with the methodical attention of a man who trusted numbers more than he trusted people. He was somewhere in his 50s, thick through the chest and shoulders, in the way of men who have spent their lives moving heavy things, with a gray-streaked beard trimmed with the precision of someone who considered his appearance a form of business communication. He looked up when the bell rang, assessed Marin with the practiced efficiency of a merchant evaluating a customer's likely purchasing power, and returned to his ledger. At the small table near the cold stove in the corner, Cass Hollowell sat with a tin cup in a posture that suggested he had been there since before the town had been built, and would likely still be there after it fell. He was an old man, or at least an old-looking man, the kind of old that happens faster out here, the leather of his face mapped with the creases of decades spent reading weather and distance. He was a trapper by trade and by disposition, a man who moved alone through country that killed other men for sport, and seemed to consider this a reasonable arrangement. He had a way of sitting that was not quite stillness, more like the coiled readiness of something that had learned patience from necessity. He looked at Marin, did not look away. That particular brand of frontier appraisal that was not quite rudeness and not quite courtesy, just the honest assessment of someone deciding how much of a factor you were going to be. Marin walked to the counter and placed the deed on the worn wood surface. Aldous Fenn finished his column of figures, set down the pencil with deliberate care, and picked up the document. He studied it for a long moment, his thumb tracing the faded ink of the property description, his spectacles now perched on his nose for the fine work of reading. She watched his face as he read, watched the small sequence of expressions that moved across it like weather. Recognition first, then the particular compression of the lips that meant he already knew what he thought about this, then the slow exhale of a man preparing to deliver an unpleasant but necessary verdict. He set the deed back on the counter with the same care with which he had picked it up. "Hollow Rock," he said. His voice was not unkind. That was almost worse. The old Ida Ashby claim. He said it the way you would say the name of a bad investment or a dead horse, not with cruelty, but with the specific sadness of confirmed expectations. "Nothing but rock and ravine up there," he said. "No soil worth speaking of. No timber of any quantity. What little water there was ran off the ridge in spring and was gone by June." He had known men who had tried to make something of that country in the years before the surveyor had drawn his lines and someone had paid 10 cents an acre for the privilege of owning a problem. Every one of them had come back down inside of a season lighter in pocket and harder in the eyes. The land up there was the kind that taught you something about yourself, he said, and not usually something pleasant. Behind her, Cass Hollowell made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, or might have been a man clearing a piece of tobacco from his teeth. It was a sound of dismissal, the sound of a conclusion already reached. "All rock and rattlesnakes," he said to no one in particular. He took a slow sip from his tin cup. "Any decent snake has sense enough to leave come October. The cold up there will get inside your bones before you even feel it working." Fenn held up a hand in the mild traffic-controlling gesture of a man who did not want things to get unnecessarily harsh. He looked at Marin over his spectacles with something that might have been genuine sympathy if it had not been so thoroughly mixed with certainty about the outcome. "My condolences on your grandmother," he said. "Ida was a stubborn woman, and I mean that as a compliment. But that land was her one blind spot. The deed's worth less than nothing, I'm afraid. It's a tax burden and nothing more." He gestured at the door with a slight tilt of his head, the gesture of a man indicating the larger world beyond. $17 will buy you a stagecoach ticket east," he said, "maybe with a meal or two to spare. That is the sensible play. There's nothing up at Hollow Rock worth the trouble of getting there. Marin looked at the deed for a moment. Then she looked up at Aldous Fenn. I'll need a good axe, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had no question in it. A bow saw, a sack of flour, 50 pounds, a block of salt, and whatever dried beans the rest of the money will cover. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it. Fenn stared at her. She watched him recalibrate, watched the sympathy in his face rearrange itself into something else, some mixture of bewilderment and the grudging respect a man sometimes develops for a caliber of foolishness he has not previously encountered. Behind her, Cass Hollowell set down his tin cup with a precise, deliberate sound. Fenn pulled a piece of brown paper from under the counter and began to calculate. His pencil worked slowly, pausing at each line. He told her the total and then told her what would be left over, which was not much, and told her with that information presented, she might want to reconsider. She looked at the number he had written. Then she pushed the coins and the bills across the worn wood. He packed her supplies in silence. He was not a man who wasted words when arithmetic had already made the argument. The weight of his judgment was present in the room the same way the smell of the goods was present, ambient and thick and unavoidable. He wrapped the axe head in burlap and tied it to the top of the pack with practiced efficiency. He loaded the flour sack. He added the salt and the beans. When it was done, he pushed the pack across the counter toward her, and for just a moment he held it there, his big hands still resting on either side of it, and he looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. It was not pity anymore. It was something older than pity, something closer to the look a man gets when he watches the river take something he can't get back. You take care of yourself out there, he said finally. She lifted the pack. The weight of it settled across her shoulders like a promise of everything the next days were going to ask of her. She adjusted the straps, picked up the axe, and walked out of Fenn's mercantile without looking back. She heard Cass Hollowell's voice through the closing door aimed at Fenn, not at her. Already given up on a stagecoach ticket. Might as well have set those dollars on fire. She did not stop walking. The road out of Silver Creek ran east for half a mile before it turned north and began to climb. She followed it until the wagon ruts faded into something more like a suggestion than a road, and then she followed the suggestion until it too dissolved into open country, and then she followed the shape of the land itself, the way the ridgeline curved, the way the ravines cut down from the high places, and told you which direction the water had once chosen to go. The weight of the flour sack was a constant and honest companion. It did not lie to her about what this was going to cost. Every uphill step it reminded her that she had chosen this, every loose stone that shifted under her boot. It reminded her that the land was indifferent to the fact of her choosing. She stopped more often than she wanted to. She set the pack down against a rock and breathed and looked at the country around her and then picked it back up and kept going. The land changed as she climbed. The grass that had been thin and yellow-dry at lower elevation gave way to fractured stone and the kind of scrub brush that seemed to exist for no purpose other than to resist anything that tried to move through it. The thorns pulled at the hem of her dress with a persistence that felt personal. The soil where soil still existed was pale and powdery, not the dark, rich earth that rewarded work, but the exhausted gray tan of ground that had been giving for a long time and had nothing left to offer. She saw no signs of habitation, no fence lines, no worn tracks from wheels or animals, no smoke on the horizon, just the sky, enormous and cloudless, and the hawks that moved in it at heights that made her feel like something very small on a very large table. The silence was complete in a way that town silence never was. Town silence was just a gap between sounds, the interval between one thing and the next. This was something different. This was the sound of a world that had been this way for a very long time and had no particular reason to change. She made camp the first night in the lee of a granite outcropping where the rock broke the wind from the northwest and held a little of the day's warmth after the sun went down. She ate a handful of dried beans, cold drank from the small creek that ran along the base of the outcropping, and lay on the hard ground with her coat pulled tight and watched the stars appear above the ridgeline, one by one until there were too many to watch individually, and they became a single overwhelming fact. She thought about Clem, his face in the window, the way he had stood with his hands at his sides, not waving, not reaching, just watching. She thought about what he would eat for supper tonight, whether anyone had remembered to check the condition of his winter boots, whether Gideon had said anything to him about why his sister was gone. She stopped thinking about it. Thinking about it was not useful, and useful was the only currency she had left. She slept. The second day was harder than the first in the way that second days always are when the novelty of difficulty has worn off and what remains is just the difficulty. Her shoulders had ached in a new and specific way from the pack straps. The balls of her feet were beginning to announce their objections to the terrain in a language of heat and pressure. She drank from two more small creeks, both of them running clear and cold off the high rock, and refilled her canteen and kept moving. Around midday, she crossed a ridge, and the country changed again, this time more dramatically. The ground dropped away into a wide ravine cut by some ancient water event. The walls of it sheer in places and striated with bands of color rust and gray and the pale ochre of exposed mineral. There were small, gnarled pines growing from improbable positions on the ravine walls, their roots sunk into cracks in the stone, their shapes twisted by years of wind into the postures of old men leaning into something. A quarter-mile down the ravine's floor, she could see where a grove of them grew in a cluster around a depression in the earth that caught enough runoff to support actual life. She noted the pines, filed them away. She was climbing out of the far side of the ravine, her thighs burning with the effort when she saw it. The cliff face rose from the earth ahead of her, without preamble or preparation, a sheer wall of gray-weathered granite that caught the late afternoon light and threw back nothing. It was impressive in the way that indifferent things can be impressive. It had not been placed here for her benefit. It had been here for 10,000 years before she was born, and would be here for 10,000 years after she was gone, and it was entirely unbothered by the distinction. At its base, where the rock met the earth, there was a darkness. A gap, a mouth and opening in the stone that was wider than it was tall. She would have to duck to enter it. This was the cave. This was hollow rock. This was her grandmother's land, her inheritance, the deed she had carried against her ribs for 2 days through country that did not want her. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. The despair that came over her was not the sharp, sudden kind. It was the slow kind, the kind that arrives like weather building from behind you until you realize you are entirely inside it. She had known in the abstract way that you know things when you have been told them by everyone around you, that this place was not what she had hoped. She had carried that knowledge with her the whole long way. But knowing a thing and standing in front of it are two different experiences. And standing here now with the pack cutting into her shoulders in the last of the day's light going orange and cold, and the cliff face rising before her, as gray and silent and purposeless as a gravestone, she felt the full weight of what she had done. Fenn had been right. Hollowell had been right. Every face in that store had been right, and she had walked away from their rightness with an owl and a sack of flour and the particular obstinacy of someone who has nothing left to lose. And she had come here, and here was this. The wind picked up from the north, slicing through her coat at the collar, and the wrists finding every gap and taking advantage of it with professional efficiency. She looked around. There was no stand of trees near enough to provide shelter. The ravine was below and behind her, a quarter-mile of scrambling and fading light. There was nothing but open country in every other direction, and the temperature was already dropping with the speed that high elevation achieved at this time of year, the kind of drop that did not negotiate. She had no other option. She shouldered the pack tighter and walked toward the darkness at the base of the cliff. The entrance was low as she had seen, and she ducked through it with the pack scraping against the stone overhead and the cold rising off the rock on either side of her hands. She could see nothing. The darkness inside was complete, the kind of darkness that is not an absence of light so much as a presence of something else, something older and heavier. She set the pack down just inside the entrance and found her tinderbox by feel working with the practiced speed of someone who has done this in cold and dark before. The flame when it came was small. It pushed back the dark in a radius of perhaps 5 feet and threw enormous shadows everywhere beyond that radius. She lifted the small burning twist of tinder and walked forward. The entrance tunnel was shorter than she expected. After only a dozen steps it opened, and the opening was not a narrowing, but a widening, a sudden expansion of space that she felt before she could see it, the air pressure changing, the sound of her own footsteps returning to her from farther away. She held the flame out and moved it slowly, and as her eyes adjusted, she began to understand the scale of what she was standing inside. It was a chamber, A real chamber with a ceiling that arched 20 feet above her head in a vault of pale stone, the surface of it smooth in the way that only long exposure to moving water can make stone smooth. The walls curved outward from the floor in gentle parabolas, and the floor itself was not the broken rubble she had expected, but a surface of sand and gravel, fine and dry, the kind of surface that had been sorted and settled over millennia by the slow, patient work of water that was no longer present. She walked the perimeter, the flame guttering as she moved. The chamber was perhaps 40 feet across at its widest. At the far end, the ceiling lowered again, and another passage opened narrower than the first, leading back and down into rock. She noted it. She did not follow it yet. What she noticed first was the temperature. Inside the entrance tunnel, the air had been cold, carrying the chill of the outside world. But here in the main chamber, something was different. The air was cool, yes, but it was a stable cool, a consistent and unchanging temperature that had nothing to do with what was happening outside. It was the temperature of deep earth, the temperature of stone that has been insulated by its own mass from the fluctuations of seasons and weather, holding the average of summer and winter in an equilibrium that changed very slowly, if at all. The wind that had been cutting through her coat ceased to exist, completely, not diminished, gone. She stood still for a moment and felt this fact. Her tinder was burning low. She had perhaps another minute of light. She moved toward the back passage, quickly ducking into it, following the curve of the rock with one hand on the wall. The passage ran for perhaps 15 feet, turning once, and then it opened into a smaller chamber, lower ceilinged, with a crack in the far wall that ran from floor to ceiling, perhaps 2 inches wide at its broadest. And from the crack, a sound. She almost missed it. It was nearly inaudible, lost in the vast quiet of the rock. But she stopped, and the sound found her. A slow, rhythmic drip. One drop, then silence for 3 seconds. Then another drop. Metronomic, patient, indifferent to all urgency. She held the last of her tinder flame near the crack and watched. A single drop of water formed at the lip of the rock above the crack, trembled there for a moment, gathering itself and then released. It fell and struck the floor with a clear, resonant sound, a note that rang briefly in the small chamber and faded. She looked down. In the rock floor, worn by exactly this process repeated over thousands of years, was a small, shallow depression, smooth and cupped, filled with perhaps a quart of water, that caught the last of her tiny flame and returned it as a perfect reflection. She touched her finger to the water. Cold, yes, but the kind of cold that came from deep earth, not from exposure, not from contamination. She brought her finger to her lips. Clean, absolutely clean, the taste of stone and time, and nothing harmful. The tinder burned out, and the darkness returned completely. She crouched in the dark for a long moment, with one hand pressed flat against the rock floor of the chamber, feeling the temperature of it against her palm. Cool, stable, radiating a deep and consistent cold that was not really cold at all, but a kind of thermal truth, the earth's own temperature held in the stone like a memory. She thought about the winter that was coming. She thought about the temperature outside, which would drop below zero in January and stay there for weeks. She thought about the wind she had felt on the ride out here, the kind of wind that found you no matter where you hid from it, that came through walls and under doors and between the fibers of your coat. She thought about what it cost to heat a structure against that wind, how much wood you needed, how quickly you burned through it, how the cold came back the moment the fire went out. Then she thought about where she was sitting right now, deep inside 40 feet of granite, in an air temperature that could not drop because the rock around her had not dropped in temperature in 10,000 years and was not going to drop tonight. In a chamber that the wind could not reach, had never reached, would never reach. With clean water dripping from the wall, in a slow, continuous supply that did not care about drought or season. The people in Silver Creek had looked at this place and seen a hole in the ground. They had walked to the entrance, perhaps, and felt the dark and the cold of the tunnel, and formed their opinion and reported it back to each other as fact. Not one of them had gone far enough to find the water. Marin Ashby pressed her hand flat against the living rock and felt something shift inside her chest. Not joy, not yet. Something older and more fundamental than joy. The sensation of solid ground appearing under your feet when you had been falling. She found her way back to the entrance by keeping one hand on the wall. Outside, the stars were appearing, and the cold was serious, and the wind was doing what it had promised to do. She gathered enough dry brush and a few dead branches she found along the base of the cliff face to build a small fire just inside the entrance tunnel, enough to boil water and warm the dried beans she had been carrying. She ate in the cold and the dark with the sound of the wind outside and the sound of dripping water behind her, and she made her calculations. The cave would be the core, the stable heart of everything, but she could not live entirely underground. She needed a structure against the cliff face, a cabin built from the entrance, outwards sealing the mouth of the cave and creating a shelter that combined the warmth of fire with the thermal stability of the rock behind it. The cabin would face the morning sun. It would be small, 12 paces by 8 paces, no more than she could build alone with the tools she had. The trees were a quarter-mile down in the ravine. The flat stones for a foundation were scattered across the hillside to the east. The raw materials existed. They were heavy and far away and plentiful and hers. She lay down on the dry sand of the cave floor with her coat pulled up to her chin and the last of the entrance fire throwing moving shadows on the stone overhead. And she went over the plan one more time in her mind, the sequence of tasks, the logic of the construction, the order in which things needed to happen. She went over it until it was solid, until she could see each step from the inside. Then she slept, and the rock held its temperature around her through the night, and in the morning she was warm enough to start. The first tree she tried to fell took her most of the morning. She had watched her father work with an axe perhaps 100 times. She understood the principle of it. You cut a notch on the side facing the direction you wanted the tree to fall, then you cut from the opposite side until the remaining wood was too thin to hold the weight, and the tree chose the path of least resistance. It was simple. It was physics. What she had not understood, watching it done, was the specific demand it made on the body. The angle of the strike, the rotation of the hips, the way you had to let the weight of the axe do the work rather than your arms, which were weaker and tired faster. She understood this in theory. Her first 20 strokes taught her that understanding a thing in theory is a description of the work that remains to be done. She swung too hard at first burying the blade and then having to lever it out, wasting energy on the retrieval. She adjusted. She learned to read the wood, to feel through the handle when the blade was biting efficiently and when it was deflecting. She found the rhythm of it slowly, the way you find the rhythm of anything physical, through repetition and failure, and the small adjustments that failure demands. By midday, she could feel the difference between a good stroke and a poor one before the blade made contact, some quality of the windup that communicated itself. The tree fell badly, glancing off a neighboring trunk and landing 20 degrees from where she had intended. She stood there breathing hard and looked at it and noted the error and decided what had caused it and did not feel defeated by it because there was no energy available for feeling defeated. She had a tree on the ground. That was the fact. Everything else was adjustment. Getting the log to the building site was a problem of a different order entirely. She could not lift it. She had known she could not lift it. What she had not worked out in advance was the exact mechanics of moving something that weighed perhaps 400 pounds a quarter mile across uneven ground. She stood next to it for a while and thought about it with the specific concentration of someone who has no one to ask and must therefore figure it out. She had seen her father move heavy things with levers. She had seen the men at the mill use rollers beneath timber to move it across the yard. She gathered branches, trimmed them into rough cylinders, with the bow saw laid them in a row beneath the log, and wedged a longer branch under the log's end with a rock as a fulcrum. The first time she tried to use the lever, she got the angle wrong, and the log rolled sideways off the rollers. She reset the rollers. She adjusted the fulcrum. She tried again. It moved, barely grudgingly, in a short rolling motion of perhaps 2 feet before she had to reset the rollers. 2 feet. She looked at the quarter mile of ground between her and the cave entrance and calculated the number of resets this was going to require, and then set her jaw and reset the first roller. By the end of that first full day, she had moved one log approximately 40 feet, and she was so tired that she sat down against a rock to rest and did not wake up until the stars were already out and the fire she had planned to build had not been built, and the temperature had dropped to the point where the cold was its own kind of alarm. She moved fast after that, building the fire with shaking hands and eating and drinking and getting her blood going again before she lay down properly. She lay in the cave with her muscles announcing their conditions in specific and unflattering terms, and she thought tomorrow will be faster. Because I know now what I am doing. Tomorrow is always faster because of today. It was not always faster. Some days were slower because of new problems that today had not introduced, but the general principle held. She learned. Every day she learned something specific, something that could not be learned any other way than by doing it wrong first. By the end of the first week, she had 12 logs stripped of their branches and lying in a rough pile near the cave entrance. She had begun to understand her body's new vocabulary, the difference between the fatigue that meant rest and the fatigue that meant stop, the way her hands moved differently now, with a precision that was new and not entirely unpleasant to notice. The foundation came next. She spent 3 days gathering flat stones from the hillside to the east, carrying them back 2 and 3 at a time, in a sling she fashioned from her second dress. Each stone had to be assessed for flatness, for weight, for the way its edges would mate with the edges of the stones beside it. She became briefly intensely expert in the taxonomy of stones. She set them into the ground, leveling them by eye and by feel, measuring the perimeter with her own paces. 12 steps one direction, 8 the other. She walked the perimeter when it was done, 12 steps by 8 steps, and she tried to feel the space. It described the space that was going to be hers. It was small. It was enough. The first wall was a lesson in the engineering of limitations. She could not lift the logs into place alone, not to the height required for the second course and above. She built an A-frame from 2 of her lighter-cut branches and her rope using the trunk of the nearby stunted tree as an anchor, and devised a crude pulley system that tripled her effective force at the cost of tripling the distance she had to pull. She got the geometry wrong the first time, and a log swung sideways when it was halfway up, and she had to let it down and reposition everything. She got it right the second time. The walls went up slowly, each log notched at the corners with cuts she learned to make with a precision that improved measurably with each successive cut. She chipped the bark away where logs would sit on logs, flattening the contact surfaces to reduce the gaps. She studied the way each timber settled into the ones below it and adjusted the cuts on the next one accordingly. The structure that was emerging from this process was rough in every particular. The gaps between the logs were wide in places, uneven in others. The corners were not perfectly square, but it was plumb and it was solid, and when she put her shoulder against the first wall and pushed, nothing moved. The chinking was cold and miserable work. She mixed the sandy soil from the ravine bottom with water from her canteen and dried grass she had gathered from the hillside, kneading the mixture into a paste that held together and could be pressed into gaps. Her fingers went numb repeatedly. She warmed them at the fire and went back to it. The gaps in the first wall took a full day. By the end of it, the wind did not come through the wall anymore. She pressed her face close to the chinking and could not feel the draft that had been there that morning. One wall at a time. She stopped thinking about the whole of it and thought only about the part that was in front of her today. The fireplace was the thing she was most uncertain about. More uncertain than the walls, more uncertain than the roof poles she would have to notch and fit across the top. She had seen 100 fireplaces. She had sat in front of 100 fires. She had never built one, and she understood at a fundamental level that a fireplace was a claim you were making about the behavior of hot air and smoke, and the air and smoke would test the claim immediately and without mercy. She identified the back wall of the cabin as the face of the cliff itself. This was the design advantage she had been building toward from the beginning. The cliff face would be her back wall, its mass holding heat, its surface already sealed by 10,000 years of weathering. In the cliff face, perhaps 8 feet above the cabin floor, there was a natural fissure, a crack perhaps 3 inches wide, that ran diagonally upward and outward through the rock. She had found it on her first exploration of the entrance area, and she had thought about it every day since. She widened the bottom of the fissure with patient work, using her knife in a heavy flat stone to chip away at the rock, widening it to perhaps 6 inches where it met the fireplace opening she was constructing below. She built the fireplace body with the flattest, densest stones she had, setting them with the mud mortar and letting each course dry before adding the next. She shaped a throat above the firebox, a narrowing that she hoped would generate the draft she needed, and connected it to the widened base of the fissure above. The first time she lit a fire in it, the cabin filled with smoke in under a minute. She stood in the doorway with her eyes watering and thought about what she had gotten wrong. She thought about the chimney drawing. She had seen her father study once a diagram on a piece of paper he had shown her when she was perhaps 7 years old as an example of how hot air worked. She closed her eyes and tried to reconstruct it. The throat was too wide. She had made the narrowing too gradual, and the smoke was spreading out rather than being pulled up. She needed a sharper constriction closer to the firebox to create velocity. She let the fireplace cool. She added a course of flat stones inside the throat, reducing the opening by half. She rebuilt the connection to the fissure more carefully, removing a blockage she found where a piece of chinking material had fallen in. She spent an hour with her face pressed against the rock, listening to the way the air moved through the fissure when the wind was blowing, learning the way the natural draft worked before she tried to use it. Then she lit a second fire. For the first 30 seconds, she watched the smoke, and her hands gripped the handle of her axe, and she did not breathe. Then the smoke began to rise, tentatively at first as if testing the option. Then with confidence, then with authority, the thin gray column bending toward the throat and being drawn up and away through the fissure in the cliff face with a low, gentle sound that was the sound of physics working correctly. The heat followed immediately, rolling out from the firebox in waves, pressing against her face and hands and coat with a warmth that had nothing tentative about it. She sat down on the stone floor in front of the fire. Outside, the wind was doing what it always did at this altitude in late September, a steady and serious northwest wind that found the cabin walls and pressed against them and found no purchase in them. The chinking held. The notched corners held. The stone foundation held. The draft pulled the smoke away and left the air inside clean and warm, the temperature rising visibly as she sat there, the chill that had been present in the stone and the wood and the air since she had arrived here beginning to recede. She pressed one hand against the cliff face behind the fireplace. The stone was cool now, holding the cold it had accumulated over the long summer's end, but it was beginning to receive the heat from the fire, accepting it into its enormous mass with the patience of something that operates on geological timescales. By morning, it would be warm to the touch. By deep winter, it would be radiating that stored warmth back into the cabin during the hours the fire was banked and low. The rock was doing what the rock always did, holding, persisting, maintaining its fundamental nature against whatever was asked of it. She thought that she and the rock had something in common. She looked at her hands by the firelight. They were not her hands anymore, not entirely. The hands she had left the house with 3 weeks ago had been the hands of a girl who had done a girl's work, capable enough, in the domestic ways competent at the tasks that had been asked of them. These hands were different. The skin across the knuckles had thickened, and there were new calluses at the base of every finger, hard and honest. There was a scar on the palm of her right hand where the saw had slipped on the fourth day, a thin white line that had healed clean. The nails were gone, worn down past the quick, and the tips of her fingers were a different color than they had been, a darker color, the color of hands that have been in earth. She flexed them. They hurt. Everything hurt. And everything worked, and that was the more important fact. She got up, walked through the low passage into the cave, and stood for a moment in the inner chamber. The drip continued its patient count. One drop, a pause of 3 seconds, another drop. In the firelight that filtered faintly through from the cabin, she could see the small pool, its surface barely disturbed by each new arrival. She dipped a finger. The water was the same temperature it had been on the first night. The same temperature it would be in January when the world above was locked in ice. The same temperature it would be in the summer when the sun pressed down on the rock above with its full weight and found nothing to heat that had not already been resolved. She went back to the cabin and sat by the fire and had her meal, thin as it was, and watched the flames and did not think about Silver Creek or the faces in Fenn's store or the sound of a door latching shut behind her. She thought about the cave, about the 12 paces by 8 paces of floor space between her and the weather, about the water that was there whether she needed it or not, about the flat foundation stones she had set in the earth with her own hands, about the notched corners of the walls and the chinking between them and the draft pulling properly through the fissure in the cliff face. She thought about the grove of pines down in the ravine, still standing, waiting to be timber. She thought about what she would plant in the cave's front chamber when she had the soil carried in. Carrots first because they were patient and the cold suited them. The hardy winter lettuce that wanted nothing more than cool earth and a little water and would grow slowly and stubbornly under almost any conditions. She had seeds in the bottom of her pack folded into a square of cloth, 7 different varieties in 7 small parcels. She had bought them instead of buying half a pound more beans, and Fen had looked at her when she added them to the counter as if she had just confirmed everything he suspected about her judgment. The fire crackled. The wind pushed against the walls and found nothing to take. The rock held its temperature. The water dripped in the dark behind her. She was almost asleep in front of the fire when she noticed it. She was not sure at first that she had really seen it, and she opened her eyes fully and looked at the ground near the entrance in the strip of bare earth between the door she had not yet hung and the stone threshold. A boot print, small, the size of a boot that belonged to someone, perhaps half her size, perhaps younger, with a tread pattern that was the tread pattern of a particular boot she had seen many times on the foot of a particular 11-year-old boy in a farmhouse 4 miles west of Silver Creek. She stared at it. She looked at the door opening, at the darkness beyond it, at the empty country visible in the narrow slice of night outside. She looked back at the print. There was only one, just the one impression in the soft earth near the threshold, as if someone had come as close as the entrance and then thought better of it and retreated. She did not know when it had been made. Yesterday, perhaps, or several days ago. She could not tell from the edge condition of the print, which was dry and slightly crumbled, what the weather had been when the boot had made it. She sat with this for a long moment. Then she lay down by the fire and pulled her coat over her and closed her eyes. The rock held the temperature. The water dripped. The wind worked at the walls and found nothing to take. Outside, the stars were out in their full autumn number, undimmed by any clouds, so many that the sky between them looked like the dark gap between one star and the next, rather than the other way, around a whole different way of understanding what the night was made of. Marin Ashby lay in the warmth of the fire she had built with her own hands, in the shelter she had raised stone by stone and log by log from the raw material of an honest day's work, and the cold and the dark and the distance from everything familiar pressed against the walls of that shelter from every direction, and none of it got in. She looked at the small boot print one more time, then she looked at the fire. And in the dancing and settling of the flames and the sound of the draft, drawing clean and true through the stone above her, in the distant, patient sound of water dripping in the dark, she felt something she had not felt in long enough that she had almost forgotten it was a feeling that existed. For the first time since the latch had clicked shut behind her, Marin Ashby smiled. October arrived in the high country the way serious things always arrive, not with announcement, not with ceremony. It simply appeared one morning in the quality of the light, a particular cold clarity that was different from September's cold in the way that a warning is different from a statement. September had been the end of one thing. October was the beginning of something else entirely, something that had no interest in being gentle about what it was. Marin felt the change before she saw it. She woke to it in on the first morning of the month, the air against her face carrying a new weight, a new intent, and she lay still for a moment, cataloging the information the way she had trained herself to do. Temperature dropped another several degrees overnight. Wind from the northwest again consistent and strong. The light coming through the cabin's single small window had the flat silver quality of a sky that was considering something. She got up and built the fire and stood in front of it for a long moment, warming her hands and thinking about what October meant in terms of days remaining. What it meant in terms of the work she had not yet done. There was a great deal of work she had not yet done. The cave's interior had been divided now roughly but effectively into zones that served specific purposes. The front section nearest the entrance passage received a faint, diluted version of the daylight that came through the cabin. This was where she was building the growing beds, hauling soil up from the ravine floor in a bucket she had fashioned from a section of hollowed log, trip after trip, the muscle in her lower back developing a specific and permanent comment about this particular task. She had made 11 trips the previous day and estimated she needed at least 30 more before she had enough depth to support root growth. The soil from the ravine was darker than the soil of the hillside, richer and more granular, the kind of soil that had collected organic matter over many seasons in the sheltered depression. She could feel the difference in it when she pressed her fingers into a handful. It held together. It had intentions. She planted the carrots first. 7 seeds per inch of row pressed into the soil at the depth of her first knuckle, the way her grandmother Ida had shown her when she was perhaps 6 years old, and the garden had seemed like a miraculous and slightly magical process, rather than the disciplined management of soil chemistry and water and temperature that she now understood it to be. She planted 2 rows of the hardy winter lettuce, the variety with the small, tight heads that wanted nothing more than cool, stable conditions and a little water, and would grow slowly and without drama until it was needed. She watered them from the stone basin with a cupped hand, carefully not flooding the soil, but pressing the moisture into it a little at a time. The seeds did not respond visibly. They would not respond visibly for some time. She would tend them in the dark, in the cool, in the silence, and trust the biology of the thing, the way that life, given stable conditions and water and a minimum of light, would do what life has always done. The animal pens occupied the middle section of the cave. She built them from woven saplings, the kind of construction that required no tools beyond the knife, just patience and a willingness to sit with a pile of flexible young wood and learn the way the fibers like to go. She had spent 3 evenings on this, sitting cross-legged on the cave floor with the lantern beside her, weaving the saplings into panels that were stiff enough to hold shape and tall enough to serve their purpose. She set the panels into slots she had carved in the earth and braced them with heavier sticks. It was not elegant, it held. She looked at the completed pens one morning and thought about what needed to fill them. Thought about it in terms of weeks and seasons, not in terms of what would be comfortable or simple. She needed laying hens, at least 4 enough to provide a consistent supply of eggs through the winter without requiring more feed than she could store. She needed sheep, a ewe and a ram, a breeding pair, both for the wool and the milk and the future lambs that would extend what she was building here into something that grew rather than merely persisted. She needed to go back to Silver Creek. The thought arrived with a weight that was not entirely logistical. The town was 4 miles and a world away, and she had left it with the sound of Cass Hollowell's dismissal in her ears and Aldous Fenn's particular expression of resigned pity in her memory, and she had sworn to herself, without exactly using words, that the next time she went back to that town, she would be going back on her own terms. Not with $17 and a desperate hope, with a deliberate purpose in the clear eyes of someone who knows what she is doing and why. She went back in the 3rd week of October. She came down off the ridge in the early morning with her coat buttoned to the throat and her pack empty on her back and her face set in the specific neutral expression she had developed over the past weeks, the expression that communicated nothing except that she was engaged in a task and expected to complete it. The road into Silver Creek was familiar to her in a new way. She had walked it as a departure, and now she was walking it as a return, and those were different experiences of the same road. The bell above Fenn's Mercantile announced her as it always did. The store had more people in it than on her first visit. A ranch hand leaning on the counter in conversation with Aldous Fenn, 2 women examining a bolt of wool fabric near the window, and at the same small table near the cold stove Cass Hollowell, with a tin cup in a posture that suggested he had not moved since October. He looked at her when the bell rang. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the first time, with that flat frontier assessment, and this time something shifted in the assessment, something too small to name with confidence. Fenn looked up, and both eyebrows rose with a speed that he immediately brought under control. A controlled man. He took a moment. "You're still alive," he said. It was not quite a greeting and not quite an expression of surprise. It was a sentence in the middle of those 2 things finding its footing. "I need 4 laying hens," Marin said, stepping to the counter. "A ewe and a ram, young enough to be useful for the next several years. And another 50 pounds of salt." She watched him process this. The ranch hand had gone quiet. The women at the fabric bolt had paused in a way that was not quite looking at her, but was definitely listening. Fenn let out the low whistle that was his particular register for financial calculations that exceeded his expectations. "The animals alone will take most of what you have left," he said. "And if you're thinking about overwintering them at Hollow Rock, I would be doing you a disservice not to tell you that livestock in that country without proper shelter." "They'll have proper shelter," Marin said. He studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once and began writing up the order. She was standing at the counter counting out her remaining bills and coins when the door opened behind her. Not the bell's small announcement, but the particular way a door opens when someone of confidence and purpose comes through it, the brief admission of cold air and the immediate sense of the space rearranging itself around a new presence. She did not turn around immediately. She finished counting. "Miss Ashby," said a voice at her left shoulder. She turned. He was perhaps 40 years old, though he wore his age the way certain men do, lightly, and with intention, as if aging were a process he had decided to manage rather than submit to. His coat was a quality she had not seen much of in Silver Creek, a heavy wool with bone buttons that had been cut by someone who knew what they were doing. His boots were clean, which at this time of year in this country was a statement about effort and priority. He had dark eyes set in a pleasant face, in a manner that communicated in every small particular that he had been in rooms full of important people and had found the experience unremarkable. He held a document case under his left arm. He extended his right hand. "Vance Driscoll," he said, "Land and Property Administration, Western Counties Office. I've been hoping to catch you in town." She looked at his hand. She shook it. He opened the document case with the practiced efficiency of a man who did this often and found the specific paper he wanted on the first try, which told her the specific paper had been on top and ready. He placed it on the counter beside her coins with a small, apologetic gesture that managed to be both courteous and entirely without actual apology. "I'm sorry to bring this to you in a public setting," he said, sounding not particularly sorry. "The matter is straightforward. There is a tax obligation attached to the Hollow Rock parcel dating from your grandmother's tenure. The amount is $34. The statute allows 60 days from the date of notice for resolution before the county initiates proceedings." He said it the way you would explain train schedule to a stranger. Pleasant, informative, and utterly indifferent to the impact of the information on its recipient. The proceedings, he continued, in the event of non-payment would result in the parcel reverting to county administration, at which point it becomes available for acquisition by interested parties. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. "I understand your situation is a challenging one, Miss Ashby. The land has no established productive value. There are no improvements of significance. It would be entirely understandable and frankly advisable for you to allow the parcel to revert rather than incur further obligation." He smiled. It was a good smile. It had been practiced enough that it looked natural. Marin looked at the document. She looked at the number. $34. She looked at the coins on the counter beside it, the remainder of her resources, which were not $34. She looked at the date printed on the notice, which was today's date, and the deadline, which was 60 days from today. She looked up at Vance Driscoll. "Thank you," she said. "For the notice, of course," he said. "If you have questions or wish to discuss the matter further, my office is in." "I understand the document," she said. She turned back to Fenn. She finished counting her coins. She completed the transaction for the animals in silence. The ranch hand and the women near the fabric bolt, and Cass Hollowell and Vance Driscoll, all present in their various ways in the periphery of that silence. She felt their attention the way you feel weather as a pressure and a temperature rather than a visible thing. She loaded the crated chickens onto her back with the help of the ranch hand, who offered without being asked and whom she thanked without ceremony. She took the lead ropes of the ewe and the ram and adjusted them in her left hand and walked out of Fenn's mercantile into the cold October air. She heard Driscoll's voice through the closing door directed at Fenn in a conversational tone, discussing the parcel, its likely value, the procedural timeline. His voice had the quality of a man discussing a routine matter, which was what it was to him. She walked. The journey back to Hollow Rock with 4 crated chickens on her back and a pair of young sheep objecting to the pace and the terrain was the slowest 4 miles she had walked in her adult life. The sheep had opinions about every rock and every incline and every change in the wind direction, and they expressed these opinions with a persistence that would have been impressive in a more productive context. She spoke to them not in reassurance but in instruction, in a low, firm voice that did not request compliance, but expected it, and gradually over the course of the first mile they began to understand the contract. She did not think about $34. She thought about the deed. She thought about the deed, specifically its physical properties, the way it had been folded and refolded, the way the paper had that particular brittleness of age. She thought about her grandmother Ida, who had been a precise woman, a woman who kept records of things in the specific way of people who have learned that memory is unreliable and paper is not. She thought about the cedar chest the deed had come from, and the other things that had been in that chest, the household accounts, the receipts, the careful columns of figures in Ida's small handwriting. She thought about the lining of the deed's cover, the interior cover, the folded paper sleeve that the deed itself slid into the way it had felt slightly thicker than a single layer of paper when she had handled it the first time, and then set the thought aside because she had other things to think about. That night, after the sheep were in their pen and the chickens were in theirs, and she had checked the watering and the bedding and banked the fire in the cabin and listened to the wind doing its work outside, she sat at the small table she had built from a wide pine plank and two sections of log, and she laid the deed in front of her. She worked the folded edge of the interior sleeve apart with the tip of her knife slowly, the way you work a problem that must not be damaged in the solving of it. The paper was fragile and she was patient. The seam gave after a few minutes. Inside the sleeve, folded into quarters, was a smaller piece of paper. Older than the deed itself, the paper soft with handling, the ink faded to a brownish gray. She unfolded it with two fingers, pressing it flat against the table. It was a receipt from the Western County's tax office, dated 11 years prior, made out to Ida Ashby for payment toward property tax obligation on the Hollow Rock parcel. The amount was $25. She read it twice. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought. $34 was the total claimed. $25 had been paid 11 years ago and receipted. She had the receipt in her hand, which meant the actual outstanding obligation, if the original assessment stood and nothing had been recalculated or compounded, was $9. She had $9. She had barely $9, but she had $9 because she had found and sold two good fox pelts last week that she had trapped in snares she had set along the ravine's edge. $9 and some few cents. She folded the receipt carefully and placed it in the interior pocket of her coat, where the deed had lived for the 2 days she had carried it here. Then she took a sheet of brown paper from the packet she had bought at Fenn's store, and she wrote a letter slowly and carefully in the deliberate handwriting of someone who is composing a legal argument rather than a correspondence. She addressed it to the office of the district magistrate in the county seat, which she knew from the heading printed on Driscoll's notice. She described the receipt. She recorded its date, its amount, its issuing office. She stated that the remaining obligation after deducting the prior payment was $9, and that she was enclosing said amount in full settlement of the claim. She enclosed the $9. She wrote a second copy of the letter identical to the first and kept it. In the morning, she would go back to Silver Creek. She would send the letter and the money by the mail rider, who passed through 3 times a week. And she would keep the copy of the letter in the same place she kept the receipt, pressed flat against her ribs in the interior pocket of her coat, which was the safest place she had. She blew out the lantern and lay down and listened to the sheep settle into their new sleep and the wind move against the walls, and found nothing to take. She was nearly asleep when she heard the sound outside. Not the wind, which she knew now by its particular patterns, its rhythms, and its habits. Something else. A footstep. 2 footsteps. Then silence. Then the careful sound of someone or something circling the cabin's exterior at a distance of perhaps 20 feet. She lay still with her eyes open. The sound moved around to the cave side of the structure, paused there for a longer interval, and then receded. She heard nothing more after that. Whatever it was had come to the edge of her lantern's residual glow and had assessed what it found there and had decided something. She did not sleep easily after that, but she slept. She sent the letter the next morning and returned to the work of late October, which was the work of accumulation and preparation, the ancient human task of laying in against the cold, everything that the cold would require. The woodpile had been growing for weeks, stacked against the cliff face to the east of the cabin, in a row that was now 5 feet high and 20 feet long. The logs she had felled and split and stacked with the systematic patience of someone counting on each piece. She kept counting. She kept adding. She harvested the last of what the surrounding land offered. Dried grasses from the ravine floor bundled and tied for animal fodder. A patch of wild onions she found in a protected south-facing depression, small and sharp, preserved in the salt that she had portioned carefully for exactly this purpose. The roots of certain plants she had learned from her grandmother's kitchen were edible if cooked long enough. She found them with a stick and extracted them and added them to the store with the methodical thankfulness of someone who does not take even small gifts for granted. She was returning from one of these foraging trips, her arms full of bundled grass, when she found Cass Hollowell sitting on the chopping stump outside her cabin door. She stopped. The distance between them was perhaps 30 feet. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had his hat in his hands and his elbows on his knees in the posture of a man who has come for a specific purpose and is working out how to start it. He was not supposed to be here. That was the simple truth of her reaction. He was a Silver Creek man, a Fen Store man, a man who belonged to the world she had walked away from, and his presence here was an intrusion into a space she had built specifically and deliberately to be outside all of that. She walked to the door and set down the bundled grass and looked at him. Hollowell turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the cliff face. His eyes moved over the structure with the thorough attention of a man who spent his life reading landscapes and could not turn that habit off even when the landscape was made of logs and stone. He looked at the woodpile. He looked at the closed door and the chinking in the walls and the way the cabin sat against the rock as if it had grown there. Something moved across his face that was not quite what she would have expected from him. It was there for a brief moment, and then it was gone. He looked back at her. Driscoll, he said. He let the name sit for a moment on its own. I know who he is, Marin said. No, Hollowell said. You know what he says he is. He turned his hat again. He used the same paper on a widow woman over near Cedar Ridge last year. Claimed unpaid taxes on her late husband's grazing allotment. Had the county warrant by the time she could read through all of it. He paused. She was gone before winter. Driscoll's man was running cattle on that land by December. Marin looked at him. I'm not telling you how to handle it, he said. He stood up from the chopping stump and settled his hat back on his head with the precise adjustment of a man who had been wearing hats and win for 40 years. I'm not saying you'll win. I'm saying you should know what you're dealing with before you decide. He looked at the cabin one more time. His expression had gone neutral, back to the flat frontier assessment. He nodded once the way men out here nodded when they had completed what they came to do, and conversation as a social activity had reached its natural limit. Then he walked away. Down the path she had worn into the hillside over the past weeks, back in the direction of the road back toward Silver Creek, without looking back. She watched him go. She stood there for a long moment after he had passed out of sight and around the rock outcropping, turning what he had said over in her mind the way you turn a tool over to understand the full shape of it. He had not offered help. He had not suggested a course of action. He had not told her what to do in the gentle or the firm version of that instruction. He had come here alone 4 miles off the road in the cold of late October to give her a piece of information that he felt she should have. Then he had left. She had no interest in being in debt to Cass Hollowell for anything including information. But she filed what he had told her under the heading of facts about the situation, and she moved on. 3 days later, she went back to the district magistrate's office. Not by letter this time. She went in person the 2 hours of walking to the county road and the additional distance to the next town, a price she paid without resentment because this required the kind of confirmation that a letter could not provide. She carried both copies of her letter to the magistrate, her copy, and the sent copy which she had been informed was received, and she carried the original receipt in Ida's handwriting in the original deed. She sat across from the magistrate's clerk, a young man of perhaps 25, with the overwhelmed expression of someone managing more paper than any one person should be asked to manage, and she laid everything on his desk in the order that made the argument most clearly. The clerk read, he cross-referenced. He went to a filing cabinet and returned with a folder and cross-referenced again. He did the arithmetic twice, which she appreciated. The obligation was $9 and had been fully discharged, he said. He had a stamp. He used it. He gave her the stamped confirmation with the date and the clerk's notation and his signature at the bottom. Driscoll came to Hollow Rock 2 weeks later. He came in the afternoon on a day of thin, cold sunlight, riding a good horse that he tied to the stunted tree at the edge of the building site. He walked to the cabin door with the same pleasant efficiency he had shown in Fenn's store, the manner of a man completing a scheduled task. He knocked on the door with 2 knuckles, a businesslike knock, and when she opened it, he smiled, the practiced smile. I wanted to follow up personally, he said, on the tax matter. Given the timeline and the county's procedural requirements, I thought it better to discuss the options directly, rather than let things develop in a way that might be difficult to reverse. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped to the left and let him see what she was holding in her hand. The stamped confirmation from the magistrate's clerk. She held it at reading distance and watched his eyes find the date and the stamp and the signature and do the calculation. The pleasant expression did not change. That was the impressive part. He was a man who could absorb information that went against him without showing the impact, which was a quality she recognized and cataloged without admiring it. "It appears you've been thorough," he said. "The obligation was $9, she said. "It's been discharged. You have a copy in the county file." He nodded slowly. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the cliff face. He looked at the woodpile and the door and the thin line of smoke rising from the fissure in the rock above. "You've done remarkable work here," he said. Genuinely. She could not determine how much of that was real. He untied his horse. He mounted with the ease of a man who had spent a great deal of his life on horseback. He looked down at her from the height of the saddle, and the pleasant expression was still there. The smile still technically present, but something behind it had shifted to a register that was cooler and more honest. "Winter's going to be severe this year," he said. "The old-timers are saying it. You take care of yourself, Miss Ashby." He rode. She watched him out of sight the way she had watched Hollowell out of sight, standing at the same spot, arms at her sides, face neutral. Then she went back inside and put the stamped confirmation in the interior pocket of her coat, with the receipt and the deed and the copy of her letter to the magistrate, and she built up the fire and set a pot of beans on to soak and went about the remaining work of the day. November arrived and intensified everything. The temperature fell with a seriousness that left no room for the qualifications of October. The grass on the hillsides went the color of old straw and then the color of bone. The small creek that ran along the base of the far ridge slowed and then stopped, and then became a line of ice that caught the low afternoon light and held it until the sun went down. The sky lost its depth, becoming a flat, pale gray that pressed down on the landscape from horizon to horizon and held there day after day without movement, without variation. She worked in that sky with her head down and her pace steady. The wood pile grew, and then it was done as much as she could cut and carry before the ground froze to the point where her log rolling system failed. She estimated it was enough. She had done the estimation, carefully working backward from the coldest projected temperatures and the number of hours the fire would need to run to maintain a survivable interior temperature, in the cubic footage of the cabin and cave space, and the insulating effect of the cliff face mass. She had done this calculation 3 times and gotten a consistent answer. She had added 20% to that answer for factors she had not anticipated. The cave was a different world now. Walking through the entrance passage from the cabin into the cave was a transition between states of being rather than between rooms. The cabin held the focused warmth of the fire-dry and amber-lit smelling of pine smoke and cooked beans, and the particular human smell of a small space inhabited by someone who works hard. The cave was cool and dark and smelled of earth and stone and the faint green smell of growing things. And in the quiet of it, the only sound was the patient drip of water into stone and the soft movements of the animals in their pens. The lettuce had sprouted. She had stood over it with the lantern one morning and seen the first pale shoots breaking the soil, barely visible, the size of a thumbnail, reaching upward in the dark for the light that existed in insufficient quantity, but apparently in sufficient quantity for this particular variety of life to decide the attempt was worth making. She had stood there for a longer time than was strictly necessary. The carrots came a week later. Thin red threads of stem, not even as tall as her little finger, leaning toward the faint ambient glow from the entrance passage, with the determined lean of growing things. December came and brought with it the first serious snow. It came at night, a polite advance notice, before the heavier business that everyone who had spent time in this country knew was still to come. She woke to 3 inches on the ground and a sky that had lightened slightly and gone a particular pale lavender white. That was its way of indicating it had more to say. She spent the morning moving the remaining loose supplies inside, checking the chinking one final time, and reinforcing the door, hanging with an additional leather strap at the base where the wind had been finding a gap. The days shortened until they were barely recognizable as days. The sun appeared late and low and disappeared early, casting long shadows across the snow from midday onward. She measured her time not by light but by fire, by the cycle of banking and feeding the flames, by the rhythm of the morning animal tending, and the evening animal tending, and the slow midday hours of maintenance that held the system together. The ewe had grown comfortable with her presence. She would stand at the woven fence and press her nose into Marin's hand with a trust that had been earned over 60 days of consistent feeding and watering and quiet company. The ram remained skeptical in the way of rams maintaining a posture of dignified reserve that she respected. The hens had settled into their cycle of scratching and settling and laying with the focused competence of animals that have found an acceptable situation and intend to continue it. She found an egg one morning that was larger than the others. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling its weight and temperature, this small, self-contained fact that her system had produced from nothing more than clean water and dried grass and shelter from the cold. She put it in the pot for breakfast, and it tasted like something earned. The snow came again in the second week of December. More serious this time. A foot overnight, and then one the next day, that moved the snow from where it had landed into new configurations, building drifts against the cabin's east face that reached to the windowsill, and effectively added an outer layer of insulation to the wall that she had not planned but gratefully accepted. She measured the temperature inside the cabin at the coldest hour before dawn and found it 15 degrees warmer than the outside air with only a bank fire. With a full fire, the differential was enormous. She was rationing the firewood now, not from fear but from discipline, the kind of careful management of resources that the system required. She had enough. She had calculated enough. The rationing was the practice of the calculation, the daily demonstration that the numbers she had run were sound. In the evenings, she worked by firelight on things that required no daylight. She sharpened the axe blade on a smooth, flat stone until it held an edge that she tested on paper and found honest. She mended her coat with clumsy but methodical stitching. She braided rope from strips of cured hide, using a technique she had worked out herself over several evenings of failed attempts, the finished product not beautiful but functional. She made a second pair of working gloves from the remainder of the hide thicker than her first pair, lined with a layer of the dried grass she had more than enough of. She did not feel lonely. This was the fact that would have surprised the people in Silver Creek most, she thought, if they had been able to observe it. They had imagined her here in this isolation with the loneliness of it pressing in from all sides, the absence of human company as a punishment, a deprivation. What they had not understood, because they had never had occasion to understand it, was that loneliness required a certain kind of emptiness, a space in which the absence of something was the dominant experience. Her days had no such space. Every hour was occupied by a task that required her full attention, and the tasks were connected to each other in a chain of purpose that stretched from morning to night without interruption. She was not lonely. She was alone, and those were different countries. She was cleaning the ash from the firebox on the morning that the atmosphere changed. It was subtle at first, a quality in the air that she had not encountered before, a heaviness, a kind of pressure in the ears that reminded her of the moment before a very large sound, the held breath before impact. The animals noticed it before she named it. The ewe stopped eating mid-bite and lifted her head and stood very still, her eyes wide. The hens, which had been scratching with their usual commentary, went silent one by one until the cave was quiet in a way it had never quite been quiet before. She walked to the cabin's small window and looked out. The sky was the wrong color. Not the pale gray of winter overcast, not even the deep charcoal of a snow sky preparing to deliver. It was a color she had no name for, a greenish, bruised yellow at the horizon that faded to a flat white overhead, the color of something sick, the color of weather that has made a decision about the scale of what it intends to do. The wind died completely. She had never heard this hillside without wind. In 6 weeks at Hollow Rock, in every hour of every day, there had always been some wind, some movement of air from one place to another, some evidence of the world's mechanical processes continuing. The silence of no wind was more alarming than any sound she could have heard. She moved fast. She checked the animal water. She checked the feed supply. She brought the remaining loose items inside that she had left on the south face of the cabin, stacking them against the interior cave wall. She checked the firewood store the one final time, counting the rows, running the arithmetic one more time in her head. She filled every container she had with water from the drip pool, every pot, every bucket, every hollowed vessel she had made, lining them up in the cave in the order she would use them. She checked the door brace. She checked the chinking in the north-facing wall, the wall most exposed to the prevailing wind. She found one gap she had missed and pressed new chinking into it and smoothed it flat and held a candle flame near it and watched the flame to see if it moved. It did not move. She was at the window again when the first particles arrived, not snowflakes, not even what she would have called snow. Hard pellets the size of sand, grains driven horizontally by a wind that arrived without warning. No building, No introduction, simply present at one instant in a way it had not been the instant before. The pellets struck the glass of her window with a sound like thrown gravel. Then the sound rose. She had heard wind before. She had heard the hard northwest wind and winds of late autumn that pressed against the cabin walls and made the logs creak. She had heard the howling that came through the ravine when the weather moved through the gap in the ridge to the east. She thought she understood wind. What she heard now was in a different category. It was not a sound that the weather made. It was the weather itself expressed a sound, the full weight of the system that had been building somewhere to the north for days or weeks, moving down the face of the mountains and arriving here in a form that contained everything it had gathered on the way. The cabin shook, not dramatically, not with the violence of structural failure, but with the constant trembling of something absorbing an immense and sustained force. She walked into the cave and stood for a moment in the absolute shelter of 40 feet of granite. Back here, 15 steps from the cabin door, the storm did not exist. She could feel the vibration in the rock under her feet if she stood still, a very faint, transmitted tremor from the world outside. She could hear nothing. The sheep were still standing, alert, their ears tracking something. The hens had retreated to the highest perches she had built them. The drip of water into stone was unchanged and different. She placed her hand flat against the cave wall. Cool. Stable. It had not changed. It would not change. The storm could do everything it was capable of doing, and this rock would note it the way a mountain notes a sparrow landing on its peak. With the faintest possible acknowledgement that the event had occurred and no concern whatsoever about it. She banked the fire carefully and settled in for the night. She lay with her coat over her and listened to the roar that was the storm and felt the warmth that was the rock and thought about the reciprocal relationship between those two things, the way the violence outside was, in direct and measurable proportion, the reason that the peace inside was possible. She was thinking about this in the drifting way of thoughts near sleep when she heard something that was not the storm. She was sitting up before she had finished hearing it, her body responding before her mind had completed the analysis. Because her body had spent 6 weeks learning the exact vocabulary of this place, the exact inventory of its sounds, and what she had just heard was not in the inventory. It came again. A thudding, irregular, weak losing force with each impact. Not an animal. Animals did not knock in patterns. The pattern, even as irregular and diminished as it was human. 2 knocks. A pause. 2 more knocks. A muffled sound that was not a word, but had the shape of a word, the outline of someone trying to speak through layers of cold and exhaustion, and the physical impossibility of the air outside. She was off the floor and at the fireside before the sound came a third time. The poker was in her hand, the weight of it honest and cold. She stood at the door with the fire at her back and listened. The knocking came again, weaker, and beneath it the sound she had been hoping not to hear because it made what she had to do inevitable. Not aggression, not intent, just the sound of someone at the very bottom of what they had left. A sound she could not unhear, a sound that bypassed every calculation about resources and risk and the stored capital of 6 weeks of brutal work and spoke to something older and less negotiable than any of that. She lifted the brace from the door. She opened it 6 inches. Cass Hollowell fell through the marble and hit the floor of the cabin and did not move. She had the door closed and braced before she turned to look at him. The snow he had brought in was already melting and the cabin's warmth spreading across the floorboards in a dark stain. He was coated in it in the ice and snow of hours in the open, and his face when she turned him over was a color that faces should not be, a pale blue-gray, that the firelight could not warm even as she watched. She dragged him toward the fire. He was heavier than he looked, and he gave no assistance to the process. His eyes opened. Not fully, halfway and wavering. He tried to speak. What came out first was not language, but something that had been language before the cold had worked on it. She leaned close. "Finn's wagon," he said. The words came one at a time, each one costing something. Overturned on the ridge road. He stopped. His chest worked. "His wife," he said. "Both of them. Out there." Marin Ashby sat back on her heels and looked at the man on her floor. She looked at the fire. She looked at the door beyond which the storm was doing everything it was capable of doing to the world. She thought about Aldous Fenn in his store with his ledger and his spectacles and his resigned expression. She thought about the sound of his voice saying that the sensible play was a stagecoach ticket east. She thought about the silence of the store after she had pushed her coins across the counter. She thought about Dorothea Fenn's sigh of genuine distress as she had watched Marin lead the sheep out of Silver Creek. She thought about a woman lying in the snow beside an overturned wagon on the Ridge Road, and how long a person could remain there, in what was happening outside, and what the answer to that calculation was in terms of time remaining. She wrapped Hollowell in her only spare blanket and positioned him as close to the fire as safety allowed. She went to the cave and came back with a cup of water from the drip pool. She made him drink some of it, tipping it carefully into his mouth, and most of it went in. She built the fire up higher than she had been allowing herself to build it, the rationing suspended in favor of the immediate requirement, and she watched the blue color in Hollowell's face begin slowly and reluctantly to recede towards something more compatible with continued existence. Then she went to the far wall where her coat hung, and she put on every layer of clothing she possessed. Wool undershirt, second wool shirt, the mended coat. She wrapped the thick scarf around her face until only her eyes were exposed. She put on the double-thickness gloves she had made from the cured hide. She took the lantern from the hook and filled it. She took the pot of stew that had been sitting at the back of the fire all evening, still hot, still sealed with its wooden lid. She took the rope. She tied one end to the iron ring she had fixed to the cabin's exterior wall for exactly this kind of contingency, though she had not known at the time what contingency she was preparing for. The other end she tied around her waist in a knot she tested 3 times. She unbraced the door. The storm did not wait for an invitation. It came through the door opening with the force of something that had been waiting, and the cold of it hit every exposed surface of her face and took her breath for a full second before she was able to draw again. She stepped through and pulled the door behind her, and the world closed in from all sides with an indifference that was not malice, had never been malice, but produced the same practical result as malice without any of its complications. She put her face down against the wind and found the cliff face with her left hand and began to move. The rope was the only honest thing in the world. Everything else had dissolved. The landscape she had memorized over 6 weeks of daily movement across it, the ridgelines she could have traced from memory with her eyes closed, the rock formations she had cataloged and named privately, in the way you name the landmarks of a place you intend to stay, in all of it was gone. The storm had taken the visible world and replaced it with a single undifferentiated white that was not a color so much as an absence of information, a blankness that pressed against the lantern from every direction and gave nothing back. The rope was real. The rope was 40 feet of her own braiding, cured hide and patience tied to the iron ring in the cabin wall and tied around her waist and running between those 2 fixed points across the chaos of the in-between. As long as she held it, she knew where she was in relation to where she needed to return to. As long as it held, she was tethered to the system she had built to the fire and the warmth and the water and the man on her floor who needed her to come back. She kept the cliff face on her left for the first 30 feet. It was the one surface the storm could not move, and she moved along it with one gloved hand, brushing the rock, using it the way a blind person uses a wall, as a source of orientation in a world that had no other fixed points. The cliff face ran roughly northeast, which was the direction she needed to travel to reach the ridge road. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. The wind was coming from the northwest and she was moving at a right angle to it, which meant it hit her on the left side of her face and body with a sustained force that wanted constantly to push her southward and off her line. She leaned into it, not fighting it exactly, compensating for it the way you compensate for a current when you are crossing moving water, angling into it, so that its push becomes part of your vector rather than an obstacle to it. She had never crossed a river in a current strong enough to matter, but she understood the physics of it, and understanding it was what she had, so she used it. The snow was thigh-deep in places and knee-deep in others, with no visible pattern to predict which was coming next. Each step was a test, her foot going down and finding something and deciding in the fraction of a second before her weight committed whether the something underfoot was solid enough to hold. She fell twice in the first 100 yards, going down face first into the snow, the lantern swinging wildly in her hand. Both times she found the rope with her free hand before anything else and used it to orient herself, and then used it to pull herself upright and kept moving. The rope ran out 30 feet before she reached the ridge road. She had known it would. She had calculated the distance and known the rope was shorter than required and had decided to go anyway because the alternative was not going, and the alternative was not available to her. She tied the loose end to a rock formation she found by feel in the darkness, a jutting granite shelf at roughly knee height that she had passed 100 times and recognized now only by its shape under her hands. She tied it and kept moving. Without the rope, she was navigating entirely by the wind and the slope of the ground. The ridge road ran along a slight shelf in the terrain, a leveling of the slope that she could feel through the soles of her boots if she was paying close enough attention to the information her feet were sending. She had been paying attention to the information her feet sent for 6 weeks. She found the leveling. She turned east along it. The wagon was 40 yards further on. She almost walked into it. The lantern's light found at first the dark bulk of the overturned box emerging from the white like a shipwreck, one wheel still turning slowly in the wind, with a sound she could barely hear over the storm's roar. The horse was gone, cut loose or broken free, she could not tell. The wagon lay on its side with the cargo box facing northwest, forming a partial windbreak on its lee side, and in that lee side, in the narrow band of relative stillness, the wagon's body created against the gale, two figures were pressed together against the wood. Aldous Fenn saw the lantern first. His head came up. His face in the light was the face of a man who has passed through several stages of his situation and arrived at a stage beyond fear, a kind of stripped simplicity, the face of someone reduced to the most basic possible version of what they are. He had his arms around his wife. Dorothea Fenn was not moving or was moving very little, her body pressed against her husband's chest with the dead weight of someone who has spent most of what they had. Marin reached them and crouched down without speaking because speaking was functionally impossible, and words were not the resource required here anyway. She got her hands under Dorothea's arm on the near side and looked at Aldous and communicated with her eyes the thing that needed to happen. He understood immediately. He got his feet under him with the unsteady effort of a man whose legs have been folded in the cold for a long time and pushed upward while she pulled, and between them they got Dorothea Fenn vertical and moving her feet, finding the ground with a reflexive persistence that was the body insisting on its own continuation, even when the mind had largely stepped away from the process. The journey back was the hardest thing Marin Ashby had ever done. This was not a superlative she assigned loosely. She had spent 6 weeks doing things that were harder than anything she had done in the 18 years before them. But this was different. This was her own exhaustion, plus the weight of someone else's, her own cold, plus the management of someone else's cold, her own navigation, plus the responsibility of delivering 2 other people safely through a route that was not safe. She retraced her steps by feel, by the slope of the ground, by the position of the wind on her body. She found the granite shelf and her rope in the dark and felt along it back toward the cliff face, one hand on the rope and one arm around Dorothea Fenn's waist, Aldous moving on the other side of his wife, with his head down and his legs working with the mechanical determination of a man operating past the point of choice. She felt the cliff face come back under her left hand like a greeting. From there, she could find the door. When she pulled it open, the warmth of the cabin came out like a physical thing, a pressure against her face, a smell of fire and pine, and the stew in the pot, and the living warmth of a space that had been heated for hours. Dorothea Fenn made a sound when it hit her. It was not a word, it was the sound of a body recognizing the thing it had been moving toward through everything. Marin got them inside and got the door closed, embraced, and turned to assess. Cass Hollowell had made it to a sitting position against the far wall. The color in his face had moved back towards something viable, the blue gone replaced by a deep red flush that was the blood returning to the surface. He had the blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and he was holding the tin cup she had left him, and his eyes were open and tracking. He looked at the Fenns and looked at Marin, and something moved in his face that was not his usual expression, and then was gone. Aldous Fenn was moving under his own power now, the warmth accelerating the return of his faculties. He was looking at her with an expression that had not settled yet into any particular thing, cycling through a sequence of reactions too fast to name individually. She ignored it. There was still work. She got Dorothea Fenn out of the outer layers of her clothing, the coat and the overskirt, both of them soaked through and conducting cold against the skin underneath. She wrapped her in the remaining blankets from the chest and positioned her on the floor as close to the fire as was reasonable and elevated her feet on a rolled section of canvas. She checked her hands and ears and face for the white patches that meant serious cold damage and found the hands concerning and the rest acceptable. She poured hot water from the pot over a folded cloth and pressed it gently against Dorothea's hands, not hot enough to shock damaged tissue, warm enough to begin the process. She gave Aldous dry socks from her own store, which he accepted without comment because they were required and commentary was not. She gave him a bowl of the stew and one to Hollowell and poured a cup of water for each of them from the cave supply. Then she sat down on the floor by the fire and did not move for a while. She was aware of Aldous Fenn looking at her, looking at the cabin, his eyes moving across it with the attention of someone re-examining assumptions in light of new information. He was looking at the chinking in the walls at the stone fireplace, at the way the smoke drew cleanly up through the fissure in the cliff face without a trace remaining in the room. He was looking at the neatly stacked firewood against the interior wall, at the organized arrangement of supplies on the shelf she had built from a split log and 2 wooden pegs. He was looking at the single small window with its salvaged glass, dark now, with the storm pressing against it from outside. He was a merchant. He understood inventory. He was taking inventory of what she had built and comparing it to what he had expected to find, and the difference between those two things was doing visible work on his expression. She let it work. She had no interest in explaining herself. After some time, Dorothea stirred and her eyes opened fully. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin, at the firelight on the rough-hewn beams, at her husband beside her. She looked at Marin. "Where are we?" she said. Her voice was small and used. "Hollow Rock," Marin said. Dorothea Fenn closed her eyes again. A single tear ran sideways across her temple and into her hair, and she did not wipe it. The storm continued its work outside with complete indifference to all of this. In the morning, Marin opened the cave passage and let them see it. She took the lantern and walked through first and heard them follow her, heard the change in their footsteps as the passage opened into the main chamber, heard Aldous Fenn's breathing alter in a way that was not alarm, but something else. She held the lantern up and let the light do the work she had been doing alone for 6 weeks. The growing beds were visible from the passage entrance. 2 rows of hardy winter lettuce, each plant small and pale, but structurally perfect, reaching toward the diluted light from the entrance, with the steady intention of things that have decided to continue regardless of conditions. Beside them, the thin red threads of carrot tops stood in their rows with the quiet dignity of something that had no reason to doubt itself. She had added a 3rd bed since October planted, with a variety of low-growing herbs, and 2 of the 3 had sprouted the small, paired leaves of new seedlings, catching the lantern light in a way that made them look briefly like something precious. In their pens, the sheep turned toward the lantern with the mild curiosity of animals that have accepted their situation and found it reasonable. The ewe pressed her nose toward the wire fence. The ram regarded the newcomers with his customary reserve. In the chicken pen, the hens moved through their morning inspection of the ground with the focused professionalism of workers who have a system and are following it. And from the back chamber, in the perfect silence behind all of this, the drip of water into stone. 1 drop a pause, another drop unchanged from the first night she had heard it, unchanged from any night since, indifferent to blizzards and human drama, and the passage of seasons simply continuing, because continuing was its nature. Aldous Fenn stood in the middle of the chamber, with the lantern light on his face, and did not speak for a long time. He looked at everything the way she had seen him look at his store inventory, the thorough merchant's assessment, the accounting of what is present and what it is worth, and what it would cost to replace. But the expression underneath the accounting was not the expression of a merchant. It was the expression of a man encountering an argument he has been making confidently for months and discovering that the argument was wrong. He looked at the growing beds. He looked at the water that she showed him in the back chamber, the small pool in the stone, the steady drip from the fissure above it. He pressed his hand against the cave wall and felt the temperature of it, the stable cool that held its ground against everything happening 40 feet above his hand. He turned to look at her. There were things moving in his face that were difficult to separate from each other. She watched them without helping him. The shame was part of it. The genuine awe was another part, distinct from the shame, a separate recognition. The gratitude was present, but it was not simple, because the gratitude was entangled with the awareness of what he had said to her in his store and how he had said it, and the fact that she was here because of decisions he had specifically advised her against, and she had been right and he had been wrong, And 3 people were alive this morning in direct consequence of that. We were wrong, he said. The words came out with the particular compression of something that has been waiting to be said and has finally found the form it needed. His voice broke on the second word, and he did not apologize for it. We called you a fool. He stopped. My God, he said quietly, we were the fools. Marin had thought at various points over the past weeks about this moment. She had imagined it in different versions, in moments when the loneliness of the work pressed close, and she had needed something to move toward. She had imagined it with triumph in it, with the particular satisfaction of the vindicated, the clean pleasure of a proof point. Standing here now, she felt none of that. What she felt was something quieter and less easy to name. The fatigue was part of it. The cold that was still in her from last night's work was part of it. But mostly it was that she was looking at a man who was genuinely reckoning with something, and that reckoning had a weight to it that made triumph seem beside the point. She turned and walked back toward the cabin. There is food, she said without looking back at him. Come and eat. The blizzard held them for 3 days. There was no counting hours in it, no marking the passage of time by light, because light did not vary. The world outside the window maintained its uniform white-gray opacity from what should have been morning to what should have been evening, and the only clock was the fire and the animal tending schedule, and the slow burn of the lantern that she rationed, carefully extinguishing it during the hours when firelight alone was sufficient for the work being done. They learned all of them the particular patience that the place required. Cass Hollowell, once his strength returned enough to be useful, asked what needed doing without preamble, and was told and did it without commentary. He was a man who understood work as the primary language of a situation, and he understood now that this was her situation, that the system that surrounded him was her system, and he moved within it with the deference of a man operating in someone else's jurisdiction. He carried water from the cave without being asked a second time. He added to the fire at the intervals she had established. He did not offer opinions. Aldous and Dorothea Fenn watched her. She was aware of it as a constant background fact, their observation of her daily movements, the way they tracked the things she did, and the order she did them in. Dorothea Fenn was a practical woman under the circumstances, Marin discovered. Not the sighing, sympathetic presence she had been in the store, but something more substantial when the cushions of ordinary life were removed and what was underneath was asked to operate. She helped with the animal tending once her hands had recovered enough to be useful. She asked quiet, specific questions about the growing beds and listened to the answers with the attention of someone filing information rather than making conversation. Aldous Fenn said less than his wife. He moved through the space with a kind of careful precision, as if he were aware of the exact volume he occupied and wanted to occupy as little of it as possible. He helped where he could. On the second day, he noticed a section of chinking on the north wall that had crumbled in the cold and had been on Marin's list of things to address after the storm. He repaired it himself, asking her for the mixing proportions and then working it with the methodical competence of a man who had built things before and remembered how. He did not call her attention to what he had done. She noticed it in the evening and said nothing, but she noted it. On the second morning, she went out to check the perimeter of the structure to assess the snow loading on the cabin roof and to clear the ventilation crack above the fireplace, which had shown signs of drifting. She pulled the door against the wind and worked her way around to the east side of the cabin with her hand on the wall. The storm diminished from its peak, but still serious, still capable of disorienting a person quickly beyond the familiar ground. She was clearing the drift from the ventilation crack with a stick she had brought for the purpose when she heard something. Not the storm. She had become expert in the language of the storm over 3 days, its full vocabulary of roar and whisper, and the specific pitch of wind moving around a corner versus wind moving across an open face. What she heard was not in that vocabulary. It was a sound from lower on the cliff face, perhaps 30 feet east of the cabin, where a section of the rock face jutted outward and then receded, forming a narrow alcove, perhaps 4 feet deep and 2 feet wide, a natural pocket in the stone. She had assessed it the first week and rejected it as a building site. She had noted it and moved on. She moved toward it now. The snow was drifted deep in front of the alcove, and the drift had a quality she did not expect. It was not smooth the way fresh snow drifts smooth. There was a disturbance in it, a compression in the center, where something had been lying against it from the inside. She brushed the drift aside with her arm and held the lantern toward the opening. He was curled against the back of the alcove with his knees to his chest and his arms wrapped around them and his face turned toward the rock wall. He was wearing the brown wool coat she recognized because she had helped their father purchase it at Finn's store 2 winters ago. The collar was turned up and his hat was pulled down, and between the two there was a narrow band of cold, reddened skin that was the back of his neck. Clem, she said. He turned. His face was not quite the face she had been carrying in her memory, the face of a boy who watched from behind glass. The past weeks had done something to it that she could see even under the cold, in the weariness, in the 3 days of whatever he had endured before the storm found the alcove and reconsidered leaving it. There was something in his eyes that was new, not hardness, something closer to the expression she had seen in her own face recently when she caught her reflection in the cave pool. The expression of someone who has been tested by something real and has not yet finished being tested and has decided to keep going anyway. He said her name, just her name, Marin, in a voice that was trying very hard to be steady and was not quite making it. She reached into the alcove and got her arm around him, and he came out of the opening with the stiff unfolding of someone whose joints have been cold for a long time, and she held him against her coat while the storm worked around them, and his breathing came in the uneven pattern of someone who has been holding themselves together for a long time and has just been given permission to stop. She did not say anything. She held him. After a moment, she felt him trying to pull together enough to speak. She waited. Father said he started. He stopped. Tried again. He said you wouldn't survive the winter. He said the land was nothing. He said he stopped again, and this time it was not because he lacked the words. It was because the words and the relief and the exhaustion and the 3 days of cold and alone in the rock alcove were all arriving at the same moment, and the moment was larger than his ability to be orderly about it. I know what he said, Marin said quietly. I didn't believe him, Clem said. I never believed him. She pressed her face against the top of his hat and closed her eyes for a moment. The tears came without her deciding to let them come. Not the way she would have expected tears to come, not in a rush, not dramatically. They came the way the water dripped in the cave one at a time, steady the accumulated pressure of something that had been building for weeks, finding the one particular crack that was wide enough to let it through. She did not try to stop them. She had earned them, she thought, in the specific way that people earn the right to feel the things they have been not feeling for a long time by carrying them far enough and working hard enough and finally arriving at a place where the weight could be set down for a moment without the whole system collapsing. She stood in the storm with her arm around her 11-year-old brother and cried in the quiet, private way of someone who does not do it often. And the storm moved around them with its usual indifference, and the rock held them on its lee side, and after a while she was done. She had not known until this moment how much she had needed someone to simply have believed in her. Not helped her, not approved of her choices, just believed from 4 miles away in the cold and the distance and the silence that she was not going to fail. She guided him inside. When she brought Clem through the cabin door, the room rearranged itself the way rooms do when an unexpected fact enters them. Aldous Fenn looked up from the corner where he had been working on the rope braiding she had set him, to looked at the boy, looked at Marin, and had the intelligence to read the situation accurately and say nothing. Dorothea Fenn made a sound and moved toward them immediately and took Clem's hands in both of hers and began the practical assessment of a woman who knows what cold hands need. Cass Hollowell looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he looked at Marin. The flat assessment was in his face, the long reading of a situation, and what he arrived at in his reading produced something she had not previously seen on his face. He looked away before she could determine precisely what it was. She gave Clem the warmest position by the fire and the largest portion of the stew, and she answered the questions he asked her about the cave and the animals in the garden with the patience of someone who has been waiting for months for someone to ask them. She watched his face as she described it, as she took him through the cave later with the lantern and showed him the growing beds and the animals and the drip of water into the stone basin, and she watched the same sequence of expressions that had moved across Aldous Fenn's face the morning before, but younger and without the accompanying shame, just pure unfiltered wonder. He pressed his hand against the cave wall, the same way she had pressed her hand against it on the first night, the same way Aldous Fenn had pressed his hand against it, and she thought there was something almost ceremonial about the gesture, the way it had become a form of communion with the essential fact of this place. This is why you stayed, Clem said. This is what you knew. Not knew, she said. She looked at the wall. Hoped. The storm broke on the third day. The breaking of it was as sudden as its arrival had been. One morning the window went from its uniform gray-white to a pale blue, and then the pale blue brightened, and then a strip of direct sunlight came through the glass and crossed the cabin floor for the first time in 3 days, and the room looked different in it, looked like itself, the firelight replaced by something that came from outside, and reminded you that outside still existed and was not only storm. She opened the door. The world was white and still and enormous. The storm had built the landscape into new shapes, the drifts sculpted by 3 days of extreme wind into forms that had a temporary grandeur about them, knowing they would not hold their shape once the temperature shifted and the sun had time to work. The sky above was the hard, brilliant blue of high country winter after a storm, the blue that had no softness in it, that was the color of clean and serious cold rather than warmth. It hurt to look at it directly. She stood in the doorway for a long moment and breathed it in. The air was completely still. After 3 days of the storm's roar, the silence was so complete and so present that it had a texture to it, a weight the way deep water has weight. Behind her, she heard the others coming to the doorway one by one. Cass Hollowell first standing beside her in the frame and looking out at the country with the eyes of a man recalculating routes. Then Aldous Fenn, who came to the doorway and stood there with his hands loose at his sides and looked at the transformed landscape and said nothing. Then Dorothea, who looked at the sky and pressed her fingers to her mouth briefly, a gesture that was not quite prayer and not quite relief and was perhaps both. Clem came and stood beside Marin, and she felt his shoulder against her arm. They prepared to leave after the midday meal. It was a practical timeline, enough light remaining to make it to Silver Creek before full dark. If they moved steadily, the temperature still cold enough that the snow would hold firm underfoot rather than softening into the exhausting slush of a thaw. Marin packed what she could spare for the journey, a portion of the dried beans, a wrapped section of the salted meat, not charity, fuel for a 4-mile walk in winter conditions, the kind of practical provision that the situation required. She was banking the fire for the next cycle when she heard Aldous Fenn behind her. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the cabin with his hat in his hands, which was an echo of the way Hollowell had stood on her chopping stump in October, and she noted the echo. He looked at her directly, which she had come to understand was his version of sincerity. The direct look being the thing he did when he intended to mean what he was saying. He extended his hand. In it was a gold coin. She looked at it. "This is not charity," he said. He said it without preamble because they were past the point where preamble served any purpose. "It is payment for 3 nights' shelter and meals for 3 adults and a boy. Market rate or near enough." She looked at the coin. "I know what we said," he said. "What I said, into the store." He stopped. "What I said was wrong, and I was wrong about the land, and wrong about what you were doing here, and wrong in a way that I don't." He stopped again. He was not a man who apologized easily, and she could see the effort in it, the specific effort of a person who is accustomed to being right and is now in the territory of having been wrong and finding it unfamiliar ground. "Take the coin," he said. "It is honestly owed." She took it, closed her fingers around it. The metal was cold from the interior of his coat pocket. "Thank you," she said, "for the repair on the north wall." He blinked. Then something shifted in his expression, a small, surprised movement, as if he had not expected to be seen in that particular thing. He nodded once. They walked out into the brilliant cold morning, one at a time, Hollowell first, then the Fens, then Clem stopped at the door and looked back at her. She gave him a look that answered whatever question was in his face, and he turned and followed the others. She stood at the door and watched them make their way down the slope toward the ridge road, 4 figures moving slowly through the deep snow, small against the white country. Hollowell broke trail in front of his trapper's instinct for finding the path of least resistance through terrain, putting the others in his wake automatically. The Fens walked together, close their shoulders, nearly touching. Clem walked last, and once near the rock outcropping where the path curved, he turned and looked back. She raised her hand, he raised his. Then they went around the rock and were gone, and she was alone with the snow and the sky and the silence and the sound of the cave behind her, the patient drip that continued regardless of everything. She did not know precisely how the story traveled from Aldous Fenn's memory to the collective knowledge of Silver Creek. She knew only that it did because the first evidence of it arrived 3 weeks later in the form of a neighbor she had met twice, a rancher named Pruitt from the property 6 miles south who showed up at her door one afternoon in January with a sack of seed potatoes over his shoulder and the expression of a man who had business to conduct. He had heard, he said, that she had managed to overwinter laying hens up here. He had a question about the method. She answered it. Then he held out the seed potatoes, and she understood immediately what this was. Not charity, not the pity she had seen in every face in Silver Creek on the day she had walked out of Fenn's store with her supplies and her plan. This was barter. He had something she needed, and she had something he needed, and the exchange was the honest transaction between people who had agreed on each other's value. She traded him a dozen eggs and an hour of specific information about cave temperature management for the potatoes, and she felt in the simplest possible way the meaning of what had shifted. The blacksmith came the following week, a quiet man named Teller, who had repaired tools for most of the county, and who arrived with a set of proper iron hinges for her door, and left with 2 of the leather ropes she had been making, which he said were the best cured hide braiding he had encountered. Then a farm wife from the valley below the ridge, who had heard about the cave garden and arrived with jars of her preserved summer tomatoes and wanted to know precisely what variety of lettuce grew in conditions of low light and could she have some seeds. The ledger of exchange grew. It was not spectacular. It was not the kind of story that made noise. It was the quiet accumulation of transaction between equals, each one a small acknowledgement that the judgment of Silver Creek had been revised, that the woman at Hollow Rock had proven something that did not need to be argued about anymore, because it was simply evident. Marin tracked none of this in terms of vindication. She tracked it in terms of what the compound produced and what she needed and what she could trade for the difference. The gold coin from Aldous Fenn had gone toward iron hardware, a set of proper tools she had been improvising her way around for months. The eggs and the potatoes and the herbs and the preserved food and the leatherwork all moved in and out of the system in the way that things move in and out of any system that is working correctly, finding their uses and being replaced by things of equivalent value. Clem did not go back to Silver Creek. This was not a dramatic decision. It was a practical one made over the course of the 3 days after the others had left, in the way that practical decisions are made by looking at the facts and following them to their conclusion. He was 11 years old. He was here. He had found his way here alone, and he had survived 3 days in a rock alcove in a blizzard which was evidence of a particular kind of capability that deserved to be taken seriously. He could contribute to the work of the place in ways that were real and immediate. Marin wrote their father a letter. She told him that Clem was with her and was safe and was helping and would remain for the foreseeable future. She said nothing else about the situation. She did not ask permission. She stated the fact. Gideon Ashby's response arrived 3 weeks later, carried by the mail rider who had added the Hollow Rock stop to his route without anyone officially requesting it. The letter was brief, which was consistent with her father's relationship to written language, which was that he used it only when necessary and never more than necessary. He said that he had heard she had survived the winter. He said that he had heard other things as well, which he left unnamed. He said that Clem had always been stubborn, in the same way that Marin had always been stubborn, and he said this as a statement of fact rather than a criticism, which was perhaps the closest her father had come in 18 years to a compliment. He asked at the end in a sentence that was casual in its phrasing and not casual in anything else, whether the spring planting had begun. She read the letter twice. She folded it along its original creases. She put it in the interior pocket of her coat with the deed and the stamped confirmation in the receipt in Ida Ashby's handwriting. She did not reply immediately. She thought about it over the following days without resolving it, the way you circle a thing that is not ready to be resolved, and she let it stay unresolved because resolution was not the only valid relationship you could have with something. There were other things requiring her attention. The word from the county seat delivered by way of Aldous Fenn, who sent it via Pruitt, who related in person on a visit about the sheep management she had agreed to advise him on, was that the magistrate's office had finalized the tax matter on the Hollow Rock parcel. The obligation was fully discharged. The parcel was clear and titled and would require no further proceedings. Vance Driscoll's name appeared nowhere in this summary, which was the county's polite way of noting that the particular approach he had been pursuing had reached its natural end. She received this information while she was carrying water from the drip pool to the growing beds. She nodded to Pruitt. She continued carrying the water. The ewe gave birth in the first week of March when the snow was still deep on the high ground, but the quality of the light had changed enough that the animals could feel it, the incremental lengthening of the days registering in their biology before it registered in any other way. The lamb arrived in the early morning while Marin was tending the fire, and she came through the passage into the cave to the sound of new breathing, the small, rapid breathing of something that had just arrived in the world and was working out what that meant. She crouched beside the ewe and watched the lamb try its legs and fail, and try again in the way that new things try, with the entire commitment of something that does not yet know there is an alternative. She stayed there for longer than she needed to, watching with the lanterns set down beside her, and the cave warm and dark, and the drip keeping its patient count. Clem found her there an hour later, still watching. He crouched beside her without speaking and watched the lamb, which had found its footing by now, and was nursing with the focused determination of something that had identified what it needed and was not going to be distracted from it. "They are going to need a name," he said. She looked at him. He was grinning the kind of grin that 11-year-olds produce when something is unambiguously good, a grin without complication or condition, just the simple and complete response to a good thing. "You name her," she said. He thought about it with the seriousness the task deserved. He looked at the lamb, he looked at the ewe, he looked at the cave around them, at the water, and the growing beds, and the rock walls with their particular shade of pale gray in the lantern light. "Ida," he said. Marin looked at the lamb for a moment. Then she looked at the deed she was carrying in her pocket, the paper with Ida Ashby's name on it, the 40 acres of rock and stone that had turned out to be a well and a root cellar and a fortress in a garden. She looked at her brother. "Ida," she agreed. Outside, the spring was working its slow way up the slope of the mountain, the snow line retreating a foot a day, the ground it revealed every morning a little softer and darker than the day before. Below the ravine on the south-facing slope that she had been watching and enriching with cave soil for months, she had dug the first test bed in February and found the soil workable already, the frost gone from the upper layer, the dark crumble of it under her fingers carrying the particular texture of ground that was ready. She had her seed potatoes from Pruitt and her seed packets from her original supplies and the seeds she had traded for over the winter, and the growing list of what she knew the soil here could hold, which was more than Aldous Fenn had estimated, and less than she needed, but enough to work with, always enough to work with. In the late afternoon of a day in early March, when the light had gone long and golden and the shadow of the cliff face stretched down the slope toward the ravine, in a line that told her precisely where the sun was, in its arc, she stood on the south-facing ground and looked at the vein of rock that ran through it, the exposed granite that fractured the bed and required routing around rather than breaking through. She did not see an obstacle. She saw the line the beds would follow, the natural contour that the terracing would use, the way the rock would warm in the morning sun and radiate that warmth back into the soil through the cool nights of early spring, acting as a thermal battery for the seedlings that would be planted beside it, the way the cliff face behind the cabin acted as a thermal battery for the room within. The rock did not change. The rock was the point. Everything else was the work of learning to use what the rock offered. She was still standing there when Clem came around the corner of the cabin, with his coat open to the afternoon warmth and a length of hide strip in his hands, practicing the braiding she had been teaching him in the evenings, his fingers working the pattern with the uncertain but improving grip of someone who is getting it right a little more often than wrong. He came and stood beside her and looked out at the south slope the way she was looking at it, trying to see what she was seeing. "What are you planning?" he said. She showed him with her hands, tracing the lines of the terracing in the air, the way the beds would step down the slope, following the rock vein, the way the drainage would work in the spring runoff, the way the morning light would reach each bed at the angle that maximized the short growing season. He watched her hands and nodded slowly, taking it in. "There is a lot of work in that," he said. "Yes," she said. She was not discouraged by the amount of work in it. She was the opposite of discouraged, and not because the work was easy or would become easier or had any interest in being anything other than what it was. She was the opposite of discouraged because the work was real, and it was hers, and it was connected to everything else she had built, here in the clear and unambiguous way that good work connects to good work, each thing supporting the thing before it and making possible the thing after it. The sun was moving behind the ridge now, the shadow of the cliff extending past them and down to the ravine floor, and the air was cooling with the speed of the high country dropping several degrees in minutes, the way it always did at this hour. She heard the sheep moving in the cave, the small sounds of the animals settling into their evening arrangements. She heard the chickens. She heard the water. Even out here on the south slope in the open air, if she stood still enough in the quiet of the late afternoon, she could hear it. The faint, clear note of the drop into the basin once every 3 seconds, the patient count that had been keeping time in that rock for longer than the town of Silver Creek had existed, longer than the territory itself had been drawn on any map, longer than any human idea about what this land was worth or was not worth. It had been here before anyone had arrived to have opinions about it. It would be here after the opinions were long forgotten. She turned away from the south slope and walked toward the cabin door, Clem falling into step beside her, his fingers still working the braid, getting the pattern right, finding the rhythm that came when you had done a thing enough times that your hands knew it without being told. The cabin was warm, the fire needed feeding. The lamb needed checking, and the eggs needed collecting, and the growing beds needed their evening water, and there was leather to cure and rope to finish, and the spring beds to plan in detail before the ground opened far enough to receive them. The work was not over. The work was never going to be over. That was the whole point of it. That was what she had understood from the beginning in the moment she had pushed the coins across Aldous Fenn's counter and watched his expression cycle through its sequence of reactions. Not that the work would end and something easier would begin, but that the work was itself the thing, the daily and specific labor of imposing order on a hostile piece of the world, of learning its language and responding and kind of building something that held. She pulled the door closed behind them, and the warmth of the cabin received them. And outside, the shadow of the cliff face reached all the way to the ravine floor, and the stars were already appearing in the east one by one, in the cold, clear sky above the high country. Marin Ashby stood at the window for a moment and watched the last of the light go from the western ridge. Then she turned to the fire. There was work to do, and she knew how to do it, and tomorrow there would be more, and that was enough. That had always been enough. That would always be enough. The rock held, the water dripped, the fire burned, and the woman at Hollow Rock went about her evening quiet and certain and entirely at home in the life she had built from nothing on the land that no one had wanted, the land that had turned out in the end to be everything.